Howdy folks, Uncle Mason here, the Rig Doctor. Today we're going to be taking on a question that has baffled man since the Stone Age. It's the question of buffers. Where to put them, how to use them, which ones I actually recommend that you use on your pedal board. I have no dog in this fight. I do not make a standalone buffer that I sell. I'm going to be recommending other people's products today that I think really do a great job of giving you the closest representation of your guitar plugged directly into your amplifier, even though you're running through a plethora of pedals on your pedal board. Stay tuned. I'm going to be answering questions that have come in on Instagram over the last several weeks. Let's get to it.
My name is Mason Marangella. I build rigs for the industry's top professionals. Now, I'm teaching guitarists how to build rigs like the pros, with DIY tips, easy mods, and all the tricks of the trade. I am the Rig Doctor.
So first question about buffers. I have a Polytune 3. It has a bona fide buffer in it. That with the Mesa Stowaway. I think he's asking, is that an effective way to have an input-output buffer? I think it's better than the majority of people that are buffering their pedal boards using, say, Boss pedals on the input and output, and using, say, a TU2 or a TU3 on the input, and using maybe a Boss delay or a Boss reverb as the last thing in their signal path. What you're doing here is preferable to that, and I think that that will be closer than the majority of ways that you could do things. However, I do think that you would do better with a higher quality input-output buffer. Using something like the Mesa Stowaway buffer is good. I think that the High Wire is actually a better buffer than the Stowaway, even though they're ostensibly a similar sounding buffer. I do find that they do sound different. The input buffer is specifically designed for the input of the guitar, and it's designed to represent the 1 meg input of the majority of the amplifiers that you would see on the market, and then it has a very low output impedance. Equally, the output buffer has a super low output impedance. It's extremely stable, and there's no risk there that you would have any sort of introduction of an EQ change or compression or distortion when you're driving that long cable length back to your amplifier, which is arguably the output from your pedal board will be the longest cable length in the entire system. So to answer your question, I think that that is a decent way to do it. I think you could upgrade if you wanted to, but if you're getting good results, what can I say? Next question, will I see adverse effects from having a lot of buffers in my chain? You absolutely will have adverse effects from having multiple buffers in your chain. One guy that does a really good job of explaining the impacts of this, especially in regards to sort of the Ibanez buffer type built-in buffers that are in Tube Screamers and most Boss pedals, is Brian Wampler. I'm going to link his video up here, and he does a great explanation of showing the actual impact. He looks at a white paper that was written by Jack Orman, who's kind of the godfather of kind of the early boutique and pedal mods and stuff like that, where he actually shows on a graph what the difference is between a true bypass pedal in bypass and a buffered pedal in bypass, and the impact that it has just on the bypass signal alone, how it actually rolls off a lot of the EQ on the high end, and it also attenuates the signal when you run through one of the Boss JFET style buffers. I'm actually going to show you a little clip here, which I think is apropos to this.
And you can see in this first graph here, he's running just a regular signal, not like a guitar signal, just like a sound, a sine wave, through some software to kind of measure it. Okay, so this is just the regular sound without going through anything. And then the next graph you see here is 4 true bypass pedals put together, like in parallel, or in series rather, which is how you would generally run them on a pedal board. So no change really. A little bit in the high end, probably due to the cable capacitance and not being, you know, a lower impedance. And then now we add 4 basically Boss style pedals using the JFET flip-flop electronic circuit, which basically that's just the type of circuit that the Boss pedals generally use, using FETs as kind of electronic switches rather than a mechanical switch. So you can see on this graph, it does take some signal down. It's losing, I think he says, about 2.5 decibels after 4 pedals. And it also drops out some bass in the very low frequencies, and the high frequencies, it kills a little bit of highs, not nearly as much as running 40 feet of guitar cable without a buffer though. You can kind of see in this next graph, true bypass versus the JFET bypass, 4 pedals strung in a row. So you can see there is a big difference there, which is why so many of us have insisted on true bypass, but with a buffer, because it's like, you really want some sort of buffer. I've explained this a million times, so I'm not going to go over it again. You want some sort of buffer in there for that lower impedance so your cables don't take as much high end, but too many of those, and too many of the non-true bypass circuits, you're going to see a degradation of tone.
Now you may not have Boss pedals, or maybe you have a Klon that has its own buffer that's different than a typical Boss pedal. Nevertheless, these buffers are gain stages. They're amplifiers, and each one that you add is adding additional noise floor to the entire system. So maybe even if you can get back to your original tone sonically, it's going to be noisier than it was if you just plugged your guitar directly into your amplifier. So I would really, in a best case scenario, try to limit the number of buffers you have, or use some sort of true bypass looper or switcher to get those out of the signal path so that you can just focus on having a really high quality input buffer at the beginning of the chain and a high quality output buffer at the end of the chain. Next question, what's the difference between an input and an output buffer? Well, they can be the same, but there are some designers that choose to make them slightly different. On the Mesa Boogie buffer that I recommended called the Highwire, it actually has 2 differently built buffers. One of them is a Class A input buffer. That's what's controlling all the pickup loading, giving you a nice 1 meg input. And again, all that means is that that input is replicating what the majority of amplifier inputs look like as far as your guitar pickups are concerned. So your guitar pickups are seeing what they're used to through most amplifiers that you would be listening to, whether it's a Fender or Marshall or things like that. An overwhelming majority of amps are all 1 meg on the input, so having the buffer, which is the first thing that would be in your chain on the input buffer, matching that input impedance is extremely critical in getting your pickups to react that way that they would as if they were plugged directly into the amp, and then it converts it to a low impedance signal on the output. And I think the Mesa one somewhere around maybe 80 to 150 ohms, not K. So it's a very low output impedance. And then the output buffer, which is preferably at the end of the signal path, is really designed as a line driver. It's an IC based buffer, and it was designed by one of the best guys in the business, Mario Marino, who was formerly of Access Electronics, built one of the early boutique commercial buffers in the BS2. He did a great job of designing this thing, and it sounds great. It's extremely neutral, does a great job of driving long cables. I've tested it with up to 100-foot cable on the output, and there was 0 loss, 0 change in the tone. It's an exceptional buffer, and at the price point that it is, it really is, just a no-brainer to me. So definitely check that one out if you're considering getting a standalone input and output buffer. It also has a tuner out, and has a boost switch and a gain compensation. It has all these cool things. And then another one that's different, where it's got 2 output buffers, one in the beginning and one at the end, doesn't have a specially designed input buffer, is the Empress buffer, which is also great. They're really good, very neutral, very low noise, very well built. It's a little bit smaller than the Mesa Boogie one. They have one that has less features and one that has a few more features with boosts and foot switches for the boost. They even have a stereo version. Those are essentially the same buffer in all the positions, whether you get the mono one that just has 2, or you get the stereo one that has a single input and a dual output buffer. Those are all great buffers. Again, I'm going to link all these below so you can check them out. And there's no right or wrong way to do that. It just is kind of a designer choice, and you may find that one works a little bit better for you, but I think both of those are really solid choices that are going to get you really close, if not identical, to the sound of you plugging your guitar directly into your amp. And you don't necessarily have to have differently designed ones for input and output, but it is a preference of some builders. Next question, I switched all of my pedals, my TC Electronic pedals, to buffered pedals. Am I doing this wrong? 4 out of the 10 pedals are buffered. Well, I think I kind of answered this a little bit earlier, where we talked about where you don't want to have too many buffered pedals because of the noise amplification of having all these added gain stages, the added amplifiers that are increasing the noise floor. There's also just this issue where you're just trading off input and output impedances as you add subsequent buffered pedals in the signal path. And most of the buffered pedals are not great line drivers, so you're going to be relying on an inferior pedal to drive a line. It may be great at the thing that it's built for, which is, say, distortion or delay, but in terms of being able to drive a long line, even the best of pedals are not great at doing that comparatively to a standalone buffer. So I would definitely consider rethinking that particular setup. Next question, where do buffers go in the chain? This is such a big one that everybody always gets baffled with. Again, I've covered this a little bit already, but best case scenario, input, first thing the guitar hits. This is isolating the guitar from the pedal board. Other place you need to have it, the output. This is isolating the pedal board from the amplifier. So it's creating kind of a hardwire firewall, essentially, between the amplifier and the guitar and the pedal board. So the guitar is isolated from the pedal board, the amplifier is isolated from the pedal board, and this is the best way to ensure the closest representation of the guitar plugged directly into the amp with nothing in between. Again, you need to use a high quality buffer to be able to achieve this, and ideally have as many, if not all, true bypass pedals in between in order to make sure that you're getting the very most out of your buffers. Now again, turning a pedal on, it becomes a buffer whether it's true bypass or not. So this is something that's inherent. We all have pedal boards and we're going to turn on pedals. That's part of having a pedal board. But using strategic buffers on the input and output in order to get the most neutrality, not having to rely on any one pedal to drive too long of a line, is the best way to do it, in my opinion. Next question, if you have a long cable between your pedal board and amp, which side of the cable do you put the buffer? You want to put the buffer before the output cable. So the buffer would be the last thing on the pedal board, and then you would plug your output cable that would go back to your amplifier. You wouldn't want to put it at your amplifier because it would only then be driving maybe a small patch cable that would go from that on top of your amplifier into your amp. So definitely the last thing, but you also want to have one first, as I've talked before, input and output buffer, and preferably as much true bypass in between. All right, next question. This is an interesting one. When a pedal is designed, is it voiced with a buffer in it, or is that an afterthought? Now, I can kind of take this question two ways. Are most of the guys that are designing pedals designing them by putting a buffer in front of it and considering that their overdrive pedal, let's say, is going to be having a low impedance signal coming into it all the time? It's hard to presume what it was that their design intention was, but we also can't know a lot of variables. What cable were they designing it with? Was it a super high impedance, like really high capacitance, really sensitive cable? Was it a super low capacitance cable? All these things would impact the way that the overdrive was reacting. If you have, a coily cable, let's say, going into the input of the overdrive, and then he compensated to not make it so dark because he had this really dark cable coming into it, or whether he had an amplifier that had a 500K input impedance, maybe an old Gibson amplifier instead of a 1 meg Fender style input impedance. I think that these are variables that we can't know, but I think the best and easiest way to tell whether a pedal is going to work with a buffer is to try it with a buffer and see, do I prefer the sound with a buffer? Do I prefer the sound without a buffer? This is where you get into a lot of advantages of having switchers, because you can bring buffers in and out as desired. Or if you don't like the buffer in your switcher, you can always put a buffer as one of the loops in your switcher and use that to bring in and out, or switch the order matrix to put it in a place that you like it depending on the patch. Because some people like buffers on the input when they have a clean rig and they're doing all their clean ambient stuff, but then when they go to their dirty stuff, they may find that it imparts something that they don't like. Now, I would suspect that would be an issue with the actual buffer not being that transparent. However, if you have a buffer that's working for you in the majority of contexts, this could be a consideration that you could try in order to mitigate sonic differences between, say, a clean style setup and then going to a more dirty style setup for different songs, different types of music, whatever that may be. The other way that I could take this question is when somebody implements a buffer into a pedal, like say a Boss pedal, is that something that it was designed around, or was it an afterthought? I don't know the answer to that when it comes to Boss pedals. I would suspect that the idea was to drive the line between subsequent interconnections. I don't think that it was designed to drive a long line going back to the amp. The reason why I say that is that the output impedance is unstable. And by that I mean when you have a 1K output impedance, which is the output impedance in the majority of their pedals that are very highly used, that's an unstable output impedance. Most ICs will not do very well and will react abnormally by having an output impedance that's that high. They're using a JFET buffer system. It's a flip-flop style buffer system, and it is not designed to drive long lines, especially without introducing some sort of distortion. And you may not hear that as distortion. It may just sound like warmth or fatness, but it is most certainly going to change the EQ. It's most certainly not going to represent the sound of your guitar plugged directly into your amp if you are using those. And this goes for the Klon buffer is going to be the same way. This goes for our tube screamer buffer. Fill in the blank. Most of these type buffers are not going to be effective line drivers. They may sound good and you may like the sound of them, but it's not going to be neutral. It's going to impart a sound that is different than the guitar plugged into the amp. So this is the consideration that you need to make is, do I like the sound of my guitar plugged directly into my amp? Maybe you don't. Maybe you like it with a little more mid-range or a little more sparkle on the high end. This is all good. It's like pizza. It's all good. You know, you just got to choose which way you want to go for, but I go for the way that's most neutral, the most representative of the amplifier in the guitar on its own. All right, this is a basic. Do I even need a buffer? This is the next question. So 99.9% of people are going to need a buffer. And one guy that I thought did a really easy, suggestion to people was Josh Scott in his recent buffer vlog video. And he just suggests that people go into an AB switcher, just a single AB box. He makes one that I'm going to link here that's great for doing this test. You put your pedal board into one side of the AB loop, and then you just put your guitar going directly into your amp in the other side, and you just switch in the pedal board and you switch it out with everything in bypass. And you see, does this make a difference? Do I have any loss that comparatively to plug directly into my amplifier without the pedal board? That'll give you a really clear idea as to whether there is any sonic difference and whether you need to do something to address that. So check that out. It's right here. All right, another question that's interesting is kind of going back to the fuzz thing and whether you need to use buffers. This person's asking about whether you take into consideration impedance matching. For example, buffers and fuzz pedals, or low Z, that just means low impedance volume pedals. So a low impedance volume pedal, let's just start there. Typically when you buy a volume pedal, it's a 250K potentiometer, and that's just sort of become the standard for volume pedals. Now, if you put it on the input, I would highly recommend, if you're not buffering, to get a high impedance volume pedal, which is what the majority of volume pedals are. They're 250K pots inside of the volume pedal. It is going to take some tone away. That's inherent. The only way you can get around that is by either having a buffered volume pedal, which there are a lot of people that make those or that will install them into it, or you can use something like our Vertex Boost, which allows you to connect a volume or expression pedal, and it isolates the impedance of whatever that volume pedal is. It doesn't matter the impedance of the pot, whether it's 250K or 25K or 10K, it doesn't matter. It reacts the same irrespective of that. But if you had a fuzz and a 250K volume pedal in front of it, that's not going to make a whole lot of difference because typically your guitar is going to have a 250K volume pot in it. And so it's not going to affect the impedance so much. But I think that volume pedals typically sound better after overdrives because you're using them to attenuate the volume as a master volume, and you can use your guitar volume pot to roll up or down the volume and it'll react the same as a volume pedal first in the chain. So I don't know that you gain a lot of mileage by doing that. You have more versatility if you can adjust the volume pot on your guitar to attenuate the volume and gain, and then use a volume pedal further down the line to just attenuate as a master volume for the entire system. So do I consider those things when building a board? Absolutely, I consider those things. If somebody did want to use a fuzz, we would just figure out whether there was any sensitivity between that fuzz and having the 250K volume pot and a volume pedal before it. In terms of buffers, yes, absolutely, we have to make a consideration for that. Now, if it's in a switcher, we might be able to just turn off the input buffer and it won't be an issue for the fuzz whatsoever. But if it's everything in series and in line, then we have to make a consideration to see, okay, well, does the buffer have any sensitivity on the output of the fuzz pedal? Because some pedals that are fuzzes and fuzz faces don't like driving low impedance afterwards, or they don't like hitting a 1 meg input afterwards. They like hitting something that's much lower than that. So you have to play this game where you're testing and you're hearing where does the buffer not impact the fuzz sound, especially if that's a principal part of your sound. You may have to move it several pedals down the line before you're able to use the buffer effectively as a line driver, and it doesn't have any impact on your fuzz. Now, sometimes it'll work right after, there's no issue. But sometimes, depending on the fuzz, again, these are very high impedance, they're extremely sensitive. So not testing these with the buffer and seeing where they're most effective, where the buffer doesn't react, that's something to definitely consider. Standalone buffers versus combination buffers. I think what this person means by that is standalone buffers being just a input-output buffer, like the Mesa Boogie buffer that I've been talking about, or the Empress buffer. Those are just buffer pedals, they don't do anything else. Or maybe they have a boost in them, but it's ostensibly a buffer. This is versus something like a Boss pedal where it's incorporated. Well, standalone buffer 10 out of 10 times is going to be a better solution in the majority of cases, assuming that you're getting a high quality one like the ones that I've recommended, it will typically be better than ones that are combination pedals. Typically, the combination pedals are not great line drivers, as I've said before. They're not particularly stable at driving long lines, especially if you're using them on the output. I don't recommend them as using them for their buffering aspects. I would say use them because you like the sound of what it is that they do, not because they have a buffer in them. I wouldn't do that. All right, this person I think is getting the idea here. The question is, so ideally you should have a buffer at the start of your board and at the end of your board. Yes, absolutely correct. That's the best places to have them in 9 out of 10 circumstances. Of course, having as many true bypass pedals in between will help you add to the effectiveness of those input and output buffers. But I understand there are going to be conditions where people have non-true bypass pedals in between. Nevertheless, I think that this idea still holds up in the majority of circumstances, pending that you don't have a fuzz face, as we mentioned some questions earlier. This is an interesting question here next because it's been one of the bad names that buffers have gotten. This person asks, are buffers affecting the dynamics? Well, a good buffer is designed to replicate exactly whatever's coming into it. It's one-to-one. So whatever comes in is what goes out, just at a lower impedance, no EQ change, no coloration, no nothing, completely neutral. Now, it's difficult for people to design buffers that do this. There's very few of them on the market that are completely neutral. However, if done right, there should be no dynamic change at all. It should be able to completely represent what you have, and the easy way to test a buffer, as I've said before, is you can put the buffer in an A-B switcher. You have one side with the buffer in, the other side with just the guitar going to a cable that goes to the amp, and you can hear the impact of the buffer. And if the buffer sounds exactly the same both ways, whether it's in or out, then you'll know that it's doing its job effectively and it's not going to affect the dynamics of your tone. Now, some people do like different sounds other than neutral. Maybe they like a really dark sound or a really rolled off sound, and then when the buffer gets rid of that by isolating all of the cable capacitance, then they say, well, this buffer is just so bright. Or sometimes people will use really bright cables that have super low capacitance and have solid core, center conductors that are really bright. But when they use it through a pedal board with no buffers or stuff that has a bunch of really rolled off type buffers in them, they think that, oh wow, this cable is really pretty neutral because in the context of this whole pedal board system, it sounds pretty close to normal. But then when they get a buffer and it eliminates all that capacitance after that input cable, then they find that everything sounds really bright and they don't like it. They're not realizing that it doesn't have anything to do with their buffer. It actually has to do with the type of cabling that they're using that is actually exaggerating a frequency that's not totally neutral. So that's one thing to consider when you're choosing cable types going into the input of your system. The most important cable that you're going to buy, if you're going to spend money on a cable, is the one that's going from guitar into the input buffer, which should be the first thing in your signal path. That's the one that's going to color the tone the most because there's nothing eliminating that capacitance. So everything that's being seen by the guitar will be seen in that first cable. So having something that maybe exaggerates certain frequencies that you like or detracts from certain frequencies that you don't like, whatever the case may be, that's the one that is going to have the most impact. I like Mogami 2524, but there's numerous different cable manufacturers that are out there, and you can choose the one that you think sounds best for you. Oh, this is a cool question. So the gentleman is asking about if he has an effects loop that is buffered, does that mean I don't need a buffered pedal? No, it means you do need a buffered pedal. The only thing that's affecting is what goes into the effects loop. So anything that's in the buffered effects loop, which is, by the way, a good thing to have if you have an effects loop, because those can often be very long cables that are going from the send and return. So having a buffered effects loop is extremely important. A solid state buffered effects loop will be more neutral than a tube buffered effects loop. Tubes will add color no matter what. Those are definitely good things to have for the effects loop pedals, but it will not affect what's going into the input of the pedal board. My rule around input and output buffer still stands here. You would still want to do that because that is what's going into the preamp. The effects loop is just splitting between the preamp and the power amp, and so it's only affecting the pedals when we have a buffered effects loop that are in that send and return loop that's between the preamp and the power amp. It's not affecting anything that's in front of the amplifier. So you definitely would still want to have a buffered input and a buffered output at the very end of the chain. All right, next question. Do I need a buffer if I'm running the tuner out of my volume pedal? Well, don't run the tuner out of your volume pedal unless it's buffered, but I would say just don't do it in general unless you have a super high quality splitter where it's buffering both the output for the tuner and the output out of the main part of the volume pedal, it is going to affect the sound drastically if you don't have a buffer, because it's a parallel load and it is not going to do any wonders for your tone. And it's easy for you to identify this by just pulling out the tuner out. I can guarantee if you're talking about an Ernie Ball volume pedal or similar, you're going to notice it right away. These are passive volume pedals. They are not going to do a great thing for your tone by having that tuner out utilized without any sort of buffering. Next question. Are there Vertex buffers? There are some Vertex buffers that are out there, but these are all custom builds for pedal boards. If you want what's closest to the Vertex buffer, the Vertex Boost is ostensibly the same exact output buffer. There is a buffer that is on the input of that, and then there is an expression out that has a buffered return, or I should say a buffer on the return. So you have two buffers in there, but it's not exactly the easiest way to use it on your pedal board. That's why I recommend the Mesa Boogie High Wire or the Empress buffer, because those are really designed to be on a pedal board and are great quality standalone buffers. But if you absolutely had to have one that's at Vertex on it, get the Vertex Boost, and that has an input and an output buffer in it, and I can explain to you how to use that if you want to utilize it for that purpose. Okay, next question. Will the buffer be effective if it's not the first thing that the guitar sees? Well, it'll be less effective if it's not the first thing that the guitar sees. Ideally, that's where you want to put it. And if you're finding that you're not getting the tone that you want, it could be that the buffer that you have is not a great quality input buffer. In other words, it may not be controlling the input impedance of the entire rig at 1 meg, which is typically what your guitar pickups want to see. If they're used to, being plugged into a Fender amp as the way that you've kind of calibrated your ear, or a Marshall amp, or the majority of amps, almost all 1 meg input impedance. So that's something that you may consider. Maybe you don't have the greatest input buffer if you're finding that you're having something that is not desirable sonically for you. The other thing is that the further down you put it down the line, it may or may not be as effective. If you have a fuzz face, as we've talked about before, then certainly you don't want to put it first. There's going to be a sonic impact that it's going to have as a result of using a buffer before a fuzz face. But in the majority of situations, if you have a high quality input buffer that's truly neutral, it shouldn't make any difference for the pedals that are coming after it. And if it is, it's typically because the buffer that you have is not superior to a completely neutral buffer. So some considerations to make. All right, best standalone buffer. You've heard me say it 100 times already, but I still think the best ones are the Empress buffer, both the stereo and the standard mono version, or the Mesa Boogie High Wire. Those are the two best commercially available ones that I have played, and I've played almost every single one of them, or I've had people bring me them wanting to use a different type of buffer that they've heard about or that they saw somebody else use. I can tell you, I've tried them all, and if there's some that I haven't tried, I'm open to trying them, but if it's not an input and output buffer on the interface itself, or whatever the device is that it's being housed under, if there's not an input and output buffer, to me, it's not doing the full job that a buffer should do in terms of understanding how a pedal board works. You really need to isolate the amplifier, and you really need to isolate the guitar from the pedal board. So if there's not a dual buffer setup, it is not doing the full job that a buffer needs to be able to do. So that's a consideration that I would make if I were you in terms of choosing which buffer it is that I'm going to purchase as potentially my next pedal purchase. All right, I have a buffered bypass pedal in the middle of a 6 true bypass pedal chain. Do I need a buffer? Yes, again, input-output buffer. Having one in the middle, it's not going to help you that much, because basically you don't get any signal conditioning until either you turn on a pedal before that or you hit that pedal, and then that's going to be driving the line through everything else. And if it's anything like a Boss or a Klon or a TS-808, they're not designed to drive long lines. It's not designed to drive a cable back to your amp that's 10 feet even. So that's not going to be the most neutral way to do it. Now, maybe you like the sound of that. I can't argue with that thing. I can't argue if you like the sound of it better. But if you want most neutral, I can guarantee you that you can get a more neutral result by having a high quality input and output buffer. Do buffers color tone? They shouldn't. If it's a good one, it won't. If it's the majority of buffers that are out there, it will color the tone, and it may not be a tone that you like. Maybe it is a tone that you do like. Some people like the sound of how Tube Screamer buffers work. There's even guys that build standalone buffers out of a Tube Screamer because people like that sound. It loads the guitar down. It's not as neutral as plugging into a 10-foot cable into a Fender amp, if that's the tone that you're going for, or a 10-foot cable into fill in the blank amp. It's not going to do that, but some people may like that tone. Now, again, in a perfect world, a buffer by design should be completely neutral. The number of them that actually achieve that is in the single-digit percentile. So consideration in choosing your next buffer. Okay, so the next question is, when is it preferable when you have all the pedals in line to use a buffer versus when you have a switcher to have a buffer? So in line, that just means one pedal into the next, into the next, into the next. There's no switcher, no loops that are isolating the pedals from each other. Versus, again, having all the pedals in series, just one into the next. So the same idea stands, because essentially all the true bypass looper is doing is it's putting all of them into their own true bypass loop. So whether the pedal is true bypass or not, it's being made true bypass by way of the switcher. Whereas in line, you are susceptible to any sort of buffers that may be occurring inside of pedals as you go down the succession of pedals. Still, my idea of input and output buffer still hold true. The advantage of having the switcher is if you put your buffer in one of the loops for input and output, or you have a high quality switcher like an RJM, for example, that has a high quality buffer, you can choose when and where you want to use the buffer. So if you have a situation like you got a fuzz face, you can eliminate the buffer and turn it off when you have patches that have the fuzz in use. And then when the fuzz is disengaged, then you can add back in that input buffer so that you're getting the best possible results depending on the patch change. How long do the cables have to be in order to necessitate a buffer? Well, ideally, even 10 feet, you're going to get some difference between guitar plugged directly into the amp. It's not going to sound the same. The more cable you add, the more critical the buffer is going to be. Now, if you just have no pedals at all and you just have one cable going into the amplifier like a lot of the rock and roll guys did back in the day, the buffer may not be that desirable. In fact, a lot of guys use coily cables to have a lot of capacitance going into the input of their amps because some of those amps were just so bright and they didn't have any way to tame them down. So that was one way that they could kind of simulate some roll-off going into the input of the amp so that it would create some semblance of warmth and fatness for an amp that might have been really unforgiving and really bright. But for the majority of us that are using pedals on a pedal board, really, if you're using a pedal board, you're going to need a buffer of some kind. You may not prefer the sound of a buffer, and that may be one reason why you say, well, I hate buffers. The other reason could be is that you've just not played a good buffer, and you think that you have because a big company that you admire has produced a buffer, or you saw your favorite pro XYZ use this buffer. And there's a myriad of reasons why people choose the buffers that they choose. The reality is if it's not a dual buffer, input and output buffer, high quality one like I've mentioned below, it's likely going to have some color. It's likely going to roll off some tone. There may be some compromises that you're making in terms of using this buffer. So I really, again, encourage people to do the Josh Scott test where you put the buffer into a true bypass loop. You try running a 50-foot of cable going back to your amplifier and a 10-foot from your guitar into the looper, and you bring in the buffer and you go back to driving the 50-foot cable without it, and you see how neutral it is. Or you can even try this with a shorter cable. You're going to hear, no matter what type of length cable you use going into your amplifier, adding in the buffer is going to have some impact on bringing back the neutrality. And if you don't hear any difference between the guitar cable directly to amp versus guitar cable to buffer directly to amp from there, then that means you have a high quality buffer, one that's not changing the tone. So this is an easy test for you to do. You could probably do it in the majority of music stores and be able to figure this out before you ever walked out of the door with one of these buffers. So that was an exhaustive questioning that we got courtesy of our friends on Instagram and some people that have emailed in. I don't know anything else to say about buffers. I feel like I've talked myself into a stupor thinking about buffers. This is the most I've ever talked about them in one sitting, but I'm sure glad that we were able to have this conversation and able to get you a little bit more information around what buffers do. Again, I know that I've been beating this horse the entire time, but I can't shout this from the mountaintops loud enough because there are so few high quality buffers out there. If you think that I've missed a super high quality input-output buffer, dual buffer system that is, on the beginning and end of a pedal board system, tell me what those are, and I would be happy to try them out or contact those manufacturers to see if we can get one here to test out against the Mesa Boogie Highwire and the Empress buffer, which are my two favorites of the commercially available buffers out there. The Mesa Boogie is an extremely well-built buffer. It has an input and an output buffer, like I've said, so you plug directly into this with your guitar, you go through all of your pedals, and then you come back and it has an output buffer that goes out to your amp. It also has a boost control that you can engage. It has a mute for your tuner and a tuner out. Then it also has a level compensation, so you can compensate between using your single coil pickups versus your humbucking pickups. So it has some very cool features. I don't have an Empress buffer here to show you, but I have worked with them many times, and I believe them to be a very high quality and great buffer as well. So again, I'm gonna link these for you in the description box so that you can check them out for yourself. These are available in most retailers. You can even check them out at our good friends at Sweetwater. And of course, we're here to answer questions about this exact same thing. So that's buffers in a nutshell. I know we covered a lot here, but I'd love to hear from you about the actual buffers that you're using on your rig. Are you using Boss tuners? Are you using other standalone tuners? Are you using the Bonafide buffer or TU3s on the input? How many buffers are you using, and how are you getting back to neutral? How are you getting that sound of your guitar plugged directly into the amp with nothing in between? How are you achieving that tone? I want to hear from you about the buffers that you're using in the comments below. Again, if you like the information that was displayed here today and you appreciate us taking the time to do this for you, you can support us in a number of ways. Easy way that's completely free is just to like, to subscribe. Make sure you hit the bell icon so that you stay up to date with any new content that we're coming out with. Another way you can support is go to our website, which is vertexeffects.com. You can see our whole list of pedals. We just released our brand new Nile compressor and preamp, which has kind of a classic studio preamp mixed with kind of a Neve style mic pre, kind of the style that Nile Rodgers and Prince and all the guys who had great clean tones in the 70s and 80s would use in tandem to record their clean guitar. We have that available, as well as a bunch of other Dumble inspired pedals, boosts, distortions, and overdrives, so be sure to check that out. You can buy those directly from our site. Most of them ship in 1 to 2 days, so be sure to check that out. And until next time, I'm Uncle Mason, the Rig Doctor. Adios.